So, within the last couple months, the Fallout TV series came out. It is pretty freaking good, definitely recommend it. But one thing it didn't really do was make any real mention of any locations east of the Mississippi River. In fact, the entire Fallout franchise has seldom even mentioned the state of Ohio. For those who don't know, I actually lived in Cincinnati for a year after graduating college for my first job, and it had its minor ups and probably overall more major downs, so I figured I might as well look at what would have happened had the Great War broken out while I was there. As with previous Fallout speculation videos, I'm going to go off the prediction of the United States having a population of around 400 million people by the time of the Great War in 2077. And I'm going to be assuming the same 20 to 21% overall population growth rate over 2020 statistics. In 2020, Ohio had a population of 11,799,448, making it the seventh most populous state in the country, even more populous than Georgia or North Carolina. That means its 2077 population would have been around 14,277,332. Despite being one of the most populous states in the country, much like the Carolinas and Georgia, it has almost never been mentioned in the Fallout franchise. It is one of three states that make up the East Central Commonwealth, along with Kentucky and Tennessee. Nearly every mention of the state comes from talking with Raiders and Brotherhood members in Fallout 76. Additionally, industrial-sized shortening, a junk item in Fallout 4, it's based off of Crisco and was apparently manufactured in Ohio. As with any other state, it is most likely that the first targets of a nuclear attack would be military installations. But to my surprise, Ohio actually doesn't really have a lot in the way of actual military bases. Now sure, there are several National Guard and Reserve installations such as Camp Garfield or National Guard Trading Facility Camp Perry, but there are only a handful of really major military targets. One of them is ISC Cleveland Coast Guard Base, as the Great Lakes actually has a U.S. Coast Guard presence of around 6,000 personnel, but then again that's not really a whole lot in a nation of 400 million. Then there's the Defense Supply Center in Columbus, which manages over 2 million military items and hundreds of thousands of military contracts every year, so I'm pretty sure that one's getting hit. There's also Youngstown War and Air Reserve Station in the northeast of the state. It contains just under 1,500 personnel. But by far the largest and most notable military facility in Ohio is Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It's near Dayton and northeast of Cincinnati. It is actually the largest Air Force base in the country at this time, and it currently hosts over 27,000 military personnel and is the headquarters for dozens of military units. Needless to say, that base is probably getting hit quite a few times. So, with the military targets covered, let's begin to look at all of these civilian targets. When I lived in Ohio, I would sometimes joke the state was about 10% civilization and 90% fields of corn. However, Ohio's economy is actually a lot more diverse than just growing corn, and it would present a large number of viable targets for enemy nukes. The state's industries currently include aerospace and national defense, some bioscience and healthcare, some energy and finance sectors, but much more importantly, the state actually ranks in the top 9 in production of eggs, soybeans, hogs, and corn, and it's also number 1 in the nation for the production of Swiss cheese, though I prefer cheddar, so no real harm done there. But perhaps even more notable, alongside those industries, the state produces between 14 and 17% of the nation's total steel and automobiles, and it leads the nation in rubber and plastic production. Now, that might not seem all that important, but in a total war kind of scenario, those are going to be pretty critical supplies, both during the war and during the rebuilding efforts. So, the first city on the chopping block is the state capital of Columbus. It is the most populous city, with a 2020 population of about 905,000, so the population would be just under 1.1 million by 2077. Aside from the whole Defense Supply Center probably being a pretty big target, the city does have a lot of large hospitals, banks, some steel and chemical manufacturing plants. It also has the Ohio Supercomputer Center, and it's home to Ohio State University, one of the largest universities in the country. We can deal without Ohio State, thank you very much. Next we have Cleveland, the Detroit of Ohio. It had a population of about 372,624 in 2020. But unlike a lot of the cities I've mentioned in this little mini-series, Cleveland's population has been really constantly decreasing for decades. It may very well fall below 300,000 by 2077. It was formerly a pretty big manufacturing-focused city, and it's possible, I guess, that any factories still standing could be brought back into working order in the case of a total war, such as the one we see in the Fallout universe. A lot of the current jobs there are government-driven, but it does have a little bit of banking, insurance, healthcare, and a slightly growing tech sector. Though, even with all of that, I'm kind of guessing Cleveland doesn't get targeted as much as some of the other Ohio cities. I'm not sure it has quite as much to offer for China or Vault-Tec or whoever to drop a nuke on. Now for the city in which I resided for a year after graduating college, Cincinnati. The population in 2020 was 309,317, so the 2077 population should be around 374,000. The city is the headquarters of several large companies, such as the consumer goods company Procter & Gamble, the Kroger grocery store chain, some large banks, pharmaceutical and healthcare companies, and even a bit of aerospace and steel manufacturing. It's also the home to Graeter's Ice Cream, which is the best ice cream I have ever had. The city would absolutely be targeted by a number of nukes, but it might end up having a fair chance of recovery. It's right on the Ohio River, so water, even though it would be irradiated, would be easy to come by if they can create some reverse osmosis filters or something like that that would treat the radiation, possibly much more survivable then. Furthermore, from what I remember, the city was almost divided into like a bunch of small, sort of independent towns and areas within it, which was kind of a bizarre design, but definitely something I did overall like. Those could all make pretty interesting settlements in the Fallout universe. Maybe each and every one of them would specialize in different production of certain items, and they all set up trade routes or something. The Bengals and Red stadiums could serve the same purpose of forming some kind of settlements, just like Diamond City in the Commonwealth. Also, the city would actually be really defendable from the south because there's only a few bridges across the Ohio River, so it would actually be fairly easy to defend from anyone in Kentucky trying to get over if they don't want them there. With the three biggest cities in the state being discussed, they wouldn't be the only targets in Ohio. Next up, we'll talk Toledo, which is situated on the coast of Lake Erie. Its 2077 population should be around 327,000. It's a port city on Lake Erie, which would be important for trade and possible communication, or even escape to Canada, provided Canada doesn't get hit as hard as the rest of the United States does. It's always been a major city for automobile manufacturing, which would likely be converted to making military vehicles prior to the outbreak of the nuclear war. Then there's Akron, which is southwest of Cleveland, and its 2077 population would be around 230,000. It's home to some large hospitals and care centers, some tire manufacturing, and the University of Akron, which is another large STEM university. Then there's the city of Dayton, which would have a 2077 population of about 166,000. It actually has some healthcare employment and some research and development, and that's mostly based around the whole Wright-Patterson Air Force Base being there, so it's a lot of military development. Another city is Canton, which is sort of near Akron. It's mostly an industrial-focused city, especially with steel and steel-based products, with a little bit of healthcare and agriculture thrown in. Its population in 2077 should be around 86,000. Now, there are other large cities in Ohio, such as Youngstown and Springfield, well, large by standard of me living in a town of 22,000, and those were formerly manufacturing hubs throughout the state of Ohio, but like I mentioned earlier, they're really constantly losing population. But once again, in the face of a total war, like what we see in the Fallout universe prior to the nukes going off, American manufacturing would have to see a massive rebound because we can no longer rely on countries like China for our raw materials. So what about potential factions and such? I'm sure the Brotherhood would absolutely love to move into the remains of Wright-Patterson and maybe Columbus as well, given that whole supercomputer facility and their love of technology. Though those locations would also be a possible target for the Enclave, given that they might still have a presence in Chicago, only a few hundred miles away. Cleveland probably gets taken over by a bunch of raider groups, and the survivors probably just try to flee to Canada. Or maybe the city has a chance of survival thanks to being situated on Lake Erie. Maybe that gives it a bit of an advantage. Cincinnati might fare better given the whole being divided into a bunch of smaller towns that could all sort of set up trade routes and such. They could also get food from the rural counties in Kentucky and maybe steal from plants from there to Dayton, so maybe they'd be able to rebuild. Now, another thing we need to discuss about Ohio is that it's much colder than the states we've looked at so far, and that's actually going to play into survival. The first winter there is going to be absolute hell on earth, and it would be exaggerated by the nukes, as they would cause a nuclear winter. The temperatures were regularly below zero with wind chill while I lived there, and with the nuclear winter being a thing, it's going to get a heck of a lot worse, probably throughout the entire year. Couple all of that with the fact that there's going to be very little in the way of electricity and stable homes that protect you from the elements. Survivors are going to be stuck burning wood and trash, and just trying to stay warm by any means possible. It's also going to kill a lot of the plant and animal life that's already there, so things like hunting are going to become even more difficult because all the animals are going to either be hunted to death or frozen to death, same with the plants. So I suspect that hundreds of thousands of survivors would actually freeze to death in the first winter. It would be much more noticeable somewhere like there than somewhere like Georgia or the Carolinas, where the weather is much more warm to mild. Now, thanks to the final episode of the Fallout TV series, we now have a rough map of where vaults may have been built across the United States. Ohio appears to have 2 or 3 vaults. One seems to be in the Cincinnati area, and the second looks to be right around Columbus, which makes sense as they're both major cities. There's one more in the southeast portion of the state, but I think it's actually in West Virginia, and I think it's actually Vault 51 from Fallout 76, in which an AI was allowed to have absolute control over absolutely everything, which doesn't sound like the best scenario. I like to think that one of those vaults experiments would be a test to see how long humans can survive on corn, soybeans, and Swiss cheese only, and maybe the other vault is populated by a bunch of athletes, because they're already technically some of the healthiest people out there, so it would make sense to try to rebuild with them. Given all of the big sports teams that are in the state of Ohio, it could make sense. So how does Ohio fare overall within the Fallout universe? Obviously the major cities and Wright-Patterson are getting nuked plenty of times, and it's possible some of those shrinking cities could get hit, especially if they've started to rebound and have to do a lot of manufacturing by the time of the Great War. But those larger cities and their suburbs only contain about 25 to 30% of the state's population currently, and those cities are mostly situated in either the southwest, northwest, or northeast corners of the state, plus Columbus right there in the center. So a good third of the state's land is going to become an irradiated wasteland, but aside from those areas, the state is once again pretty rural and covered in fields of corn and soybeans and such. So it's possible that as much as half the population of states like Ohio or states in the rest of the Midwest that are generally less populated and less densely populated might be able to survive. But that's of course going to heavily depend on the spread of radiation from nearby Indiana and Kentucky, and of course the effects of nuclear winter in a much colder climate. Provided the rural areas could clear the irradiated topsoil and still obtain water from the Ohio River or the Great Lakes, they might be able to grow a decent amount of food, might be able to resume some sort of manufacturing, might even be able to have more just food in general stockpiled to survive that first winter. It's possible, but as always, that's really probably a best case scenario. So at best, maybe half the population somehow makes it through after the first couple years, but once again, I suspect it's probably a little bit lower than that, or a lot lower than that. Thank y'all for watching. If you enjoyed, please give me a like, subscribe, ring the bell if you haven't done so already. The next state I will be looking at is one that has never even been mentioned at all in the existing Fallout lore, aside from knowing which Commonwealth it's supposed to be in. And it's one of the smallest states in the country by both size and population. So I'll see y'all back here real soon for another video.